Fast After the Beasts of the Sea, Hull's Whaling Legacy by Matthew Shepard. During the lead-up to and throughout the Industrial Revolution in Britain, many major cities were defined by a single industry that dominated large parts of the town's economy, and often had a ripple effect on local businesses and the overall economic prosperity of the people of said city. If this industry was doing well, so too was the town. This is especially seen in the north of England, large parts of Wales, and in Scotland. These industries often help to inform the character and identity of the people within those cities. Examples of these industries include steel in Sheffield, textiles in Manchester, and in my home city of Hull, that industry was whaling.
Whale, the largest of all. If you want any wind, well, I'll blow you a squall, and it's windy weather, boys, stormy weather.
Whaling, though rightfully and heavily frowned upon today, was a vital component of the growth of British industry during the Industrial Revolution, due to the products that could be harvested from whales, specifically oil and baleen, being incredibly useful in industrial processes, as this was before oil was being regularly drilled from the ground. Furthermore, whaling was a far more lucrative line of work for those in poor coastal communities than, say, working in the early factories, though it did come with a far greater risk of injury or death, as well as the possibility that a whaling expedition could return to port after months at sea with little or nothing to show for their troubles. Yet hundreds, if not thousands of men flocked to the whaling ships at the height of the industry, and whalers held the same level of cultural mythologizing that cowboys and astronauts would hold for later generations. Most of Hull's whaling took place around Greenland and Baffin Island, where vessels from the maritime city had been sailing for fishing since at least 1616. However, due to the influence of the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, and competition from London-based fisheries, Hull's influence in the industry was in a limited state. It wasn't until the 18th century that Hull's whaling industry began to grow into the powerhouse it became during the industrial period. Specifically in 1766, when Samuel Standage began to invest in Hull in relation to its growth as a whaling port. This investment, combined with the lack of competition from Dutch whalers and other whaling companies both in Britain and Europe, allowed Hull's whaling industry to grow to such a degree whereby at the start of the 19th century, Hull alone made up 40% of the British whaling fleet. For the city, the peak of the whaling trade came in 1820, where 62 ships returned to Hull carrying the produce from 688 whales, worth approximately £250,000 at the time, and close to £20 million in today's money. Many manufacturing businesses sprung up due to the whaling trade, which made all sorts of goods from kitchen sieves to the backs of sofas to scrimshaw. Carved artwork made on whalebone. One of the largest collections of this form of artwork resides in Hull's Maritime Museum today. Said museum also features a replica whaling boat, scale models of some of the more famous whaling ships to sail from Hull and other Yorkshire ports such as Whitby, and a collection of items relating to John Parker, one of the most successful British whaling masters of the 19th century.
It's a damn tough life, full of toil and strife, we whalermen undergo. And we don't give a damn when the gale is done, how hard the winds do blow. We're homeward bound from the Arctic around, with a good ship taut and free.
John Parker, whaling master, was born in 1803, just across the Humber in the town of Grimsby, though, like Philip Larkin, he eventually adopted Hull as his hometown. He came to Hull early in his life and began his career at sea in 1815, and was given a command in 1831. Captain Parker was a well-known and well-regarded captain, never once losing a ship, which was quite a feat for whalers at the time, despite facing the extreme hazards of his profession. Perhaps his most notable achievement as a captain came during his command of the Harmony in the early 1840s, as described as Captain William Barron in his book Old Whaling Days. A ship called the Harmony, belonging to Hull, commanded by Captain J. Parker, was very much damaged by the ice. Being full of whales, he had her rounded with chains, and in that condition brought her safely home, which caused her to be frequently spoken of as Old Harmony in Chains, to distinguish her from another vessel of the same name. Captain Parker was well regarded by other captains not just for his abilities as a commander of ships and men, but also for his personable nature and generosity with other captains that he met on his voyages. In 1851, during the search for the missing Sir John Franklin, one William Parker, of no relation, spoke of John Parker, whaling master, thusly: "We were received in the most hearty and hospitable manner by Captain Parker. Frank and lively, he seemed not to know how to make enough of us, or to give us sufficient pleasure in our visit to him." 11 years later, Captain Parker sadly died of a stroke in his home in Hull. Flags were flown at half-mast in his honour throughout the city and aboard the Truelove, the ship he commanded for close to 17 years.
Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. For the voyage is long and the winds don't blow, and it's time for us to leave her.
Unfortunately for the whalers of Hull and their families, the plentiful years did not last. In fact, there was a rapid reduction in the fortunes of Hull's whaling fleet only a year after the Great Bounty of 1820. 9 vessels were lost in the Arctic ice, and as a result, many investors withdrew their support of Hull's whaling industry. The fleet lost close to 1/3 of its number, and fortunes did little to improve in 1822. 6 more ships were crushed in the ice, and a further 8 returned to port with empty holds, having failed to catch a single whale. Though the story of John Parker, whaling master, shows that the trade did return to stability for over a decade, Hull's whaling fleet would never again reach the size and reputation it had enjoyed in 1820. By 1868, only the Truelove and another steam-powered vessel, the Diana, sailed from Hull's port, and by 1869 only the Diana remained. Unfortunately, one of her final voyages would end in tragedy and disaster. During one of her expeditions to Baffin Bay, the ship became trapped in the ice for over 4 months. 13 men aboard the vessel died, including its captain, John Grayville, a well-respected mariner within the city. When the ship eventually made her way home, Captain Grayville's body was brought home with her and buried in Springbank Cemetery. Approximately 15,000 mourners attended his funeral. His memorial reads as follows: "In memory of John Grayville of Kingston upon Hull, master mariner who, during a period of 40 years, was engaged in the northern whale and seal fishery. He died on board the steam whaler Diana in the Davis Straits on the 26th of December 1866, aged 64 years. His death resulted from exposure, anxiety, and shortness of provisions during a 4-month imprisonment in the ice, surrounded by all the dreariness and perils of a cold and desolate Arctic winter, and the subsequent death of the crew from scurvy and starvation rendered the voyage one of the most disastrous and melancholy on record. This monument was erected by the subscription of the friends of Captain Grayville as a token of the esteem in which he was held as a skillful commander, a kind and considerate master, and an affectionate husband and father." The Diana herself was wrecked 3 years later at Donanook, Lincolnshire. The whaling trade in Hull never recovered, and the vast majority of British whaling moved to Scotland, where newer models of steamships sailed until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Whaling as a whole experienced a sharp decline in the years following the First World War, as cheaper and more reliable methods of heating and lighting were found, reducing the need for whale oil considerably. It was still used to make, of all things, margarine and soap. But even these uses declined in the 1940s with the establishment of the International Whaling Commission in 1946 to regulate and set quotas for the hunting of whales due to a depleted global population. Eventually, in 1982, the IWC voted to ban commercial whaling, a ban that remains in place today. Ultimately, whaling was a vital component of Hull's industrial growth and identity as a city, and led to stories of heroism and horror alike. But from a modern perspective, the death of the industry can only be seen as a net positive for the world.
Boys, once more, go to sea once more. Well, a man must be blind to make up his mind and go to sea once more.
For over a century, Hull has celebrated its maritime history, most notably through the previously mentioned Hull Maritime Museum. Originally opened in 1912, it was moved to its current location in 1972. Said location had once been the headquarters of the Hull Docks Company. The museum remains free to visit to this day and tells not only the story of Hull's whaling past, but also of the city's heritage in the North Sea fishing industry and Hull's historic trade routes across the sea dating back to the Middle Ages. Further examples of the legacy of Hull's maritime culture can be seen with the 2 museum ships in the city, the Arctic Corsair, Hull's last surviving Sidewinder trawler, and the Spurn lightship, currently undergoing refurbishment. Other examples of Hull's maritime identity can be seen with smaller things, such as the Fish Trail, where small reliefs of various fish species are carved into the paving stones of the city and lead visitors on a tour through the historic Old Town. Finally, there is the city's current bid to be named Yorkshire's Maritime City, coming off the success of Hull's tenure as City of Culture in 2017. New exhibitions are being displayed at the Maritime Museum, and if the bid is successful, the money will be used to improve upon all of the city's museums and facilities related to its heritage with the seas. There is still a great sense of attachment to the ocean in Hull, even if today we send far fewer ships fast after the beasts of the sea.